Good afternoon, everyone. We're just gonna give it a few minutes here for a minute here for all the attendees to join in, and then we'll get going. Okay, well, we hit 30, so we're going. I got 30 attendees to start, and I'm sure we had a significant number of people register, so I'm sure they'll be logging in as they get their lunches and get seated. So I'd like to welcome everybody to our first PWCP Summer Speakers Series event of 2024. And we are pleased to have Dr. Yvonne Lawley here with us this afternoon to talk about cover crops in Manitoba. My name is Dan Cox. I'm the project manager for the Manitoba Association of Watersheds, proud host of the PWCP Summer Series, Speaker Series, and the PWCP program being delivered in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. I want to thank our partners, our project partners, Duncan Morrison with the Manitoba Forage and Grassland Association, and all his hard work on setting up our Summer Speaker Series for 2024. Our partners in Saskatchewan, the Saskatchewan Association of Watersheds, all of our watersheds in Manitoba, as well as Agri-Food and Agri-Food Canada, who are the funders of the Prairie Watershed Climate Program. I want to thank you all. Just a quick land acknowledgement. Today I'm hosting this webinar from our office here in Winnipeg, which is located on Treaty 1 lands, the original territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Anishu, Dakota, Lakota, Dene peoples, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis. So appreciate everyone joining and where we're hosting today in Winnipeg. Today's webinar has CEUs available for those of you professional agrologists and CCAs that are looking for getting your some credits for today's session. You can scan the QR code that you see on your screen. I'll have it up again at the end of the session as well, but you can scan your QR code here. If that's not working for you, you can email me after the event, and I can get your details, and we will submit a sign-in sheet to make sure you get your credits for today for today's session. Just a couple things, a couple reminders. This presentation is being recorded, and we will be posting it on our Manitoba Association of Watersheds YouTube page and most likely our webpage as well. This is a webinar, and we do use the Q&A function in Zoom. So please, you'll see that Q&A button on in your Zoom. So you select that, and that is where you can put your questions. We will be saving questions till the end of the presentation, unless something catches Dr. Lawley's eyes while she's going through this. We'll save questions to the end. And if there's any questions that we don't get answered today, we will follow up and make sure that they are answered. So please use that function as often as you like today to ensure that your questions are answered. Today's topic is obviously under one of the 3 BMPs that are covered under the Prairie Watershed Climate Program, and that is increasing adoption of cover cropping. A lot has been done in cover cropping and continues to be done in cover cropping, and a lot of farmers through Prairie Watershed Climate Program have been accessing funding for cover cropping. So it's great to hear. It'll be great to hear today from Dr. Lawley around Manitoba and the prairie conditions for cover cropping and update on that. So. With that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Lawley, and she can take it away. So Dr. Lawley is an associate professor in the plant science department at the University of Manitoba. Her area of research is agronomy and cropping systems. Dr. Lawley's research has focused on several crops, including soybeans, corn, and wheat, and a range of management practices from residue management, strip tillage to cover crops. Her research involves both small plot and on-farm field scale agronomy research. And Dr. Lawley enjoys communicating the results of her research to a wide range of audiences, including farmers, agronomists, scientists, and especially in the classrooms where she teaches at the University of Manitoba. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Lawley to our speaker series today, and I'll hand it over to you, and I'll stop sharing.
Great, thanks for that introduction, Dan, and thanks to Duncan for the invitation to do this webinar today and talk about something that's on my mind a lot, which is cover crops. And if you've taken the time to log in today in the middle of the field season, I'm hoping that cover crops are also on your minds, maybe because you're thinking about implementing cover crops this fall, or maybe you're working with farmers that are interested, and maybe you're working with really advanced farmers who've been using cover crops for several years, or maybe you're working with people who are just applying to programs like the PWCP and starting with their first cover crops. I'm hoping that there will be pieces from this presentation that that reach you where you're at. I'm just realizing that I'm talking and I haven't necessarily confirmed that my slides are being shared. Can everyone, or Dan, can you see my slides? Okay, all right. Great. So this webinar isn't the first time we've really connected with the Manitoba Association of Watersheds about cover crops. And I just want to layer in the fact that there are already resources about cover crops that you can access through the Manitoba Association of Watersheds. The first one is a webinar that I did with graduate students in 2022 through the Eastern Prairies Living Labs. And so there's some information that you might find helpful in that webinar. That feels like a lifetime ago, 2022. Last summer, maybe that feels like a long time ago as well. A former graduate student, Callum Morrison, who is now working with Manitoba Agriculture, gave a presentation that integrated his work from the 2020 Prairie Cover Crop Survey, and then some work that I did with a graduate student, Virginia Jansen, to develop the Cover Crops 101 guide that's available through the watersheds as well. And there are QR codes here to help you find these resources. And I think that this webinar also lives on the Manitoba Association of Watersheds YouTube channel. And I think in particular, this webinar that Callum did and these two resources are really great supports when you're starting out with cover crops or talking to new growers about cover crops. So I really encourage you and want to preface the things that I'm going to be talking about today on this kind of foundational material that you can already access through the watersheds. So what am I going to talk about today in 2024? My agenda for today is really to address some of the emerging challenges. And it's great to be able to be talking about challenges as opposed to just talking about brand new, like, can we do cover crops on the prairies, which is where I feel, I was in 2018, 2019, when some of my research on cover crops was starting. We've been doing research on cover crops for many years now, and we kind of know what these issues are, especially through the research that we're doing at the University of Manitoba in collaboration with farmers through on-farm research. And I think that if we're going to develop strategies that are really effective and adopted on wide scales, it's going to be because we know what our systems are and what our challenges are and what design criteria we really want to use cover crops for on the prairies. So today we're going to talk about some of the challenges that maybe you've had, maybe the challenges in trying to get farmers to adopt cover crops or even to participate in programs like the PWCP. I also want to leave you with some ideas on what's working. Even though we have had some really challenging conditions, what are these things that have been working even through some of the, the difficult and dry conditions that we've had in these past years. And now flip to 2024, we were all preparing for a really wet year or a really dry year, and it ends up being this crazy wet year. And so, isn't that just life on the prairies? And lastly, I'd like to give you some ideas where these challenges and where our work with farmers is taking future research, and talking with you specifically about strategies for intercropping cover crops, because I think that is emerging as a really important strategy, as well as a skill and an asset that we have with a lot of the farmers that are interested in cover crops. They also have some interest and experience with intercropping that we can leverage here on the prairies. Okay, so that's where I want to take you in this next half hour, and then have some time for, Q&A at the end. So feel free to put your questions in um, the question feature as we go along, and we'll go through them at the end. So we can probably, prefacing that this isn't the first conversation we're having about cover crops, I want to talk about what my definition of cover crops is. And through doing the survey project that we did with the 2020 Prairie Cover Crop Survey, farmers told us that, cover crops for them are the fall shoulder season cover crops, but they also talked a lot in that survey about their annual forages or full season covers. And so today, when I'm talking about cover crops, I really want to focus on this fall shoulder season window, because it is the most challenging, and it's what's going to be coming up for many of us this fall window. The other thing I want to, ground us in is that cover crops aren't the destination, even though I spend so much time thinking about cover crops. I'm always reminding me and the students that I work with that cover crops are a tool for us, and we are utilizing them to reach our goals. So it's not just enough to have this fall cover crop growing. We really need to figure out how we're leveraging this tool in order to reach our soil health goals. And so I want to always put cover crops in the context of all the things that we're doing to help reach these soil health goals. So cover crops are just one tool in the toolbox. Now they've got a lot of functionality to offer. If we look at this, bullet point list here of soil health principles, we can see how cover crops really tick off a lot of things on this box, like soil cover. Because we're covering the soil in the fall, we're probably not doing as much tillage. At least that's what I'm learning from farmers in my own research. They are a tool for having living roots growing for a greater period of time. They're a tool to bring more diversity into rotations. If we're looking at, what kind of covers we can grow that might complement the crops that we have in rotation. And for many, especially many of the early adopters of cover crops, they are another tool for integrating livestock, in that they bring some grazing into, or opportunities for late season grazing into the system. So cover crops are not our only tool for increasing living plant cover and having more soil cover, but it's understandable that we want to find strategies that work for us to use cover crops, because they have the potential to help us achieve many of these principles that are going to reach us to our goals of, building soil health, having more resilient soils that help us weather these extremes of dry and wet, and hopefully lead us to systems that are cycling nutrients, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and providing all these environmental goods and services that we rely on our agricultural lands to provide. So just like cover crops are one tool in the toolbox, for me as a researcher, I am trying to use many different research approaches to understand cover crops in our prairie systems. And many of these things are happening at the same time and are feeding back into each other. So the work that Callum talked about in his webinar last year about our survey of farm practice, and some of the work I'm going to share with you today from an on-farm project that we've done, as well as some of the results from small plot studies, where we're really digging into the details and maybe taking on more risk in order to find out how to adapt cover crops to prairie cropping systems. So with that kind of introduction about, the scope of cover crops that I want to talk about today, and why it's important that we figure out how we can use cover crops in our prairie cropping systems, let's start with really understanding what some of the challenges we've been facing with cover crops because they're there. I think one of the biggest ones that we face just with our inherent geography is season length. And one thing that I have is experience working with cover crops in a range of places. So in the U.S., in North Dakota, where I was a researcher briefly, and during my graduate studies at the University of Maryland over in the eastern U.S. states, I've learned that every cropping system is designed to take care of or to take advantage of that full window that you have for growing crops. So most places, grow shoulder to shoulder from frost to frost, right? To take care of that, to take advantage of that long growing season. But we really do have a short season on the prairies. And we also have uncertainty about the beginning and the end of our season. But we have this long, cold winter, and that provides really finite bookends on these shoulder seasons that we have. So our challenge with growing season is our short growing season here in the north. But it's also, how do we fit in, if everyone's growing their crops from, frost to frost, how do we find and adapt these strategies that will fit with our mostly summer annual crop rotations that we do? And so thanks to some work that I did with Virginia Jansen, who I think has joined us on the webinar today, one of the things that she did in her MSc research was to look at how we can optimize cover crop performance. And so this is really looking at this triad of knowing about our location and what are our limitations, thinking about the management, and in many cases, this is our crop rotation and what crops are growing in our rotations, and then finding what species fit nicely into these niches that we have. And so Virginia screened a bunch of different cover crop species at several different planting dates. And so we got to really screen this panel of cover crops across, a bunch of different harvest scenarios or harvest date scenarios, from, a really great long window starting in mid-August to a really, really late window in mid-September. And so, we really saw a range of performances of these cover crops across these different growing windows. So we can look at the different species as a way of adapting to the different windows that we have for growing cover crops with our very short season environment. And in general, some of the species that we can really turn to, you can see the range of cover crop biomass that we have here from legume species like faba beans and peas to cereals like oat and fall rye. Those cereals are really often our most reliable biomass producers, and between oats, which winter kills, and fall rye, which will overwinter and maybe provide us with some much needed ground cover in the springtime, when we tend to have really windy conditions and dry conditions. We hope dry conditions in the spring. We can leverage those cereals to provide some ground cover with other species that might add other functional properties, like fixing nitrogen or bringing more diversity to our rotations. So from Virginia's data set, we asked a really interesting question about, the short season window. What's really limiting us most? Is it heat and our growing degree days that we're accumulating? That's the response curve that we see in the left-hand graph here. Or is it precipitation and moisture? And even though it's been really dry for a while, it was really interesting to see in Virginia's data set here just what an important driver heat accumulation is. So we see, that curve really respond to lengthening growing degree days. So finding those places that are early in our rotation are really important to have that biomass that we're hoping to have to create some soil cover. Now, all of these dots here are predicated on having enough water to germinate a seed when we put it in the ground. So our cover crops, once we had enough water to germinate them, we didn't see as much of a response to having increases amounts of precipitation when the cover crop was growing. But moisture and having enough moisture to germinate a cover crop if we plant it, especially if we're planting it in the fall, has been a limitation. And so that really gets us to our next three sort of critical issues that I want to talk about, and we'll explore this through an on-farm project that I did with a graduate student, Dale Penner. So these dry conditions that we've been having, especially during the last several years here, where we've been in these drought cycles, there's really two critical issues that are affecting whether we can establish a cover crop and then see it grow in the fall. And that is both, the amount of moisture that we have. So we've been in this dry period until this year. Now we're in this really wet year. But it's also the timing of the moisture that's been really critical. And so I think the timing piece is something I want to cycle back into a little bit later on, once we get through this data that I'm going to share about this on-farm experiment. And that's really driving the timing of moisture and what we know about patterns of precipitation, of not always having reliable moisture to germinate seeds in the fall when we plant them after harvest, is really driving some of the new work that I'm doing on intercropping cover crops, where we're trying to overcome this timing issue by establishing the cover crops earlier in the growing season, having them hang out in the understory, because that's the time of year we can more reliably have that moisture in the springtime. So that brings more layers of management complexity, but I see a lot of opportunity. Again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to, amounts of water. I also want to talk about two other really important constraints. We could have all of the moisture, all of the growing season we want, but unless logistics of getting cover crops planted are favorable for growers, and unless the cost of cover crops in terms of both establishment costs, as well as trade-offs with cash crop yields, if those two things are not in place, we're never going to see wide adoption of cover crops on the prairies beyond our early adopters who are really passionate about soil health and willing to invest. So if we're talking about, really pushing acres forward, we've got to have some strategies that are going to work out logistically and are cost effective for farmers to adopt on wide acres. So those are some of the things that we're exploring through on-farm research, because that is where you can really test those logistics at a field scale and also learn about, the budgets for these. So hopefully this information feeds into new programming that we're programming opportunities that we have, like the PWCP, and that's where it's really exciting to see some new programming that is incentivizing cover crops, because I think farmers are going to need that support starting out, but B, too, as we get more people exploring with cover crops in Manitoba, the more we can learn about these logistical and cost-effective strategies that are going to help drive wider spread adoption so that we can reach our soil health goals. So way back in 2019, my question at that time was more, can we do cover crops here on the prairies? Can we fit them into our rotations? And so that was really the goal of this project with graduate student Dale Penner. And so we were working in 6 different commercial farm fields with 5 different farmers. And we had a pretty simple experimental design. We had 4 replicated strips where the farmer was doing his normal rotation, and we added cover crops. And then we had 4 control strips where we didn't plant cover crops, and we'll talk about those control strips in a few minutes because they emerged as a really important part of this research that we did. And you can see this map here on this slide about the range of sites that we were working at in Western Manitoba, and then sort of more Eastern Manitoba and the Red River Valley. So quite a wide range of Manitoba captured in these on-farm experiments. So one of the things that we wanted to learn, connecting this with growing season length and rotations, is you know, when were farmers able to grow cover crops across these 3 years in these rotations? You can wherever the boxes are green are where we were able to plant cover crops, and wherever the box is white is where we didn't grow a cover crop in the rotation. You can see that we started the experiment in mostly the sites were in cereals in rotation because that's where we often have the longest windows. We switched in 2020 to a lot of broad season or long broadleaf crops with longer seasons like soybeans, pinto beans, even a piola crop here and a soybean crop. There we had fewer cover crops in rotation. And then in 2021, we cycled into, again, more cereals, either oats or wheat, with another canola and a field pea crop. So in general, this experiment, I think, is pretty representative that, you know, we've got to temper our expectations of how often cover crops are going to cycle into our rotations on the prairies. I think where we have fields with these longer windows, we've got to take advantage of these opportunities and then see if we can develop some agronomy that's going to work for these longer season crops. Or just accept that, you know, we're going to be accumulating these soil health benefits in a slower time, and then maybe using other strategies to build and protect soil health where we're dealing with longer season crops. So I think this data slide is all about setting expectations and what's sort of realistic for us here on the prairies. Cover crops might not be an every year strategy. And so we got to work with growers and think about your own rotations, about where are you strategically going to place these cover crops in your rotation. So one of the big metrics for cover crop performance across this on-farm data set is how much biomass we can grow. And compared to Virginia's experiments where we were struggling to grow some fall biomass, you can see here we've got, like in 2019 and 2020, pretty low amounts of biomass. And then we had some better conditions in the fall of 2021 where we had higher biomass production. I would still like to be able to grow more biomass than what you see. Like, I would really like to be able to reliably get biomass between 3,000 to 4,000 kilograms per hectare. As an agronomist, that's my design goal. But I think this is a really realistic template of sort of where we're at, especially with this strategy and this model of going and planting your cover crops after harvest. So if we want to, you know, break through this window and achieve some of these higher biomass amounts, I think we're going to have to start adapting what we're doing to agronomy. Again, I'm building to what's coming in later slides. Now, this graph shows another important thing, and that is the gold bar. So the green bars are where we grew cover crops for each farm. We like picked out, you know, talked with each grower about, you know, what crop are you growing? What's coming next? What species should we add? And we tried to optimize that. But the gold bars are our controls where we didn't plant anything, where we just had either volunteer crops after harvest growing, regrowth, especially in those oat crops when they were cut. If it rained, often the oat crops would start regrowing again. And then the last thing are weeds. So you can see that this volunteer, we're calling it a nice way to call it, we're calling it the natural fall plant community. The gold bars actually provided a significant amount of biomass, especially in 2021 when we had good amounts of moisture to germinate those volunteers or to allow that crop to regrow. So one of the big takeaways that you're going to see in one of my later slides on what's working is, you know, sometimes maybe we can just think about fostering volunteers or utilizing that fall community that might be there already. And so we may not reach my target of really high biomass production with those volunteers, but we can achieve decent amounts when conditions are favorable, thinking about volunteers. And as the project, the on-farm project evolved, one of the things we started doing was designing our cover crop mixes or what we were going to purchase seed for to complement that cover crop or the volunteers that we were going to foster as our cover crop as part of our design for these cover crop mixtures. So that is hopefully a helpful strategy. One of the places where we did see differences between the the cover crops that we seeded and the cover crops that we recruited through the control treatment volunteers is in ground cover. And I think this is important to think about also, because yes, we want cover crops, we want biomass, but we want that biomass throughout the whole field. And so I think this might relate to management decisions related to harvest, and how you are spreading or what kind of settings you're using on your combine, right? Maybe you're willing to throw some of those thins out the back in order to recruit them and utilize them as volunteers. Your patterns or the way you're driving in harvest to optimize seed spread from those volunteers. And then also residue management. So are you going to do something like harrowing after harvest to spread your straw and maybe spread some of that seed around? Okay, so we had better ground cover where we seeded cover crops because we're drilling them on regular intervals with our drill. And so if cover is your really big goal and you're willing to take on the cost of pulling your drill out and utilizing it to plant your cover crop, there's value in terms of soil cover from this data set. Now, what the real costs is, do cover crops hurt yield? Do we do no harm, or can we over time improve soil health enough to increase crop yields? So what you see here is the different cash crop types that we grew across these 7 different environments where we have yield data. And there is nothing really exciting going on here. There are really no statistical differences in yield that are driving, oh yeah, we've got to do more cover crops because we're really increasing yield. In Brandon in 2018, we saw a residue management issue and a planting issue where the dry beans were planted almost in the same seed row as the fall rye cover crop that preceded it. And so we want to make sure that we're optimizing these sorts of residue management of the cover crop itself in order to optimize the cash crop. So our data set here is not very inspiring in terms of look at the impact of soil health on benefiting cash crop yields, but it does suggest that as long as we have fairly conservative biomass production or very limited biomass production, we're not limiting yield. We can try and integrate these rotations or these different crops over time. We index cash crop yields to be able to compare across yields. And when we do that over those 7 site years, we see a 2% decrease in yields across the 7 site years where we are following them with cover crops. And I think this is really important. Again, it's not a large yield difference, it's significant statistically, but we need to move this mark so that it's positive. And I think the agronomy of how we're going to do cover crops is important. Now, we had those series of sites where we didn't grow cover crops in 1 year of the project. And so what we were able to do is look at the sequence of if we grow cover crops the year before our cash crop, and then we go to the second cash crop after it, we can look at this 2-year legacy of the fall cash crop. And we see any negative effect really was no longer significant after that legacy year, after the second year without cover crops. So some not inspiring yield data. We did look at the Saskatchewan assessment of soil health. So this is a soil health method that Kate Congreaves is adapting from the Cornell soil health method across these sites. And we did, again, not super inspiring after 3 years where most sites had 2 to 3 years of, or 2 to 3 cover crops grown. We really didn't see the low biomass crops that we grew really move the mark on soil health, with the exception of one site, a cover crop, where I would say that manager was really pushing for higher biomass production, which may or may not have always worked out. And I think that there's this tension between growing these big plants to move soil health forward with being conservative on the potential impacts on cash crops. And so again, we need to find these strategies that are going to work best in our conditions to optimize those 2 trade-offs. And coming back to this idea that I talked about earlier with is every year a cover crop year, setting our expectations for the speed at which we're going to be achieving soil health changes, and then optimizing which crops in rotation that follow our cover crops are most at risk from yield penalties. So that's some of the ongoing work that I'm doing right now to keep looking at those. The great thing about doing this on-farm project is that we also got to work with real farm budgets. And so one of the things we wanted to do with these growers was take a look at the costs of growing cover crops. And so we looked at the impacts of cash crop revenues, and that is by far the largest proportion of costs borne across these site years. These are very similar across these numbers, both in terms of the impact on cash crop revenue, as well as the impact or the cost of establishing the cover crops are very similar to a few other studies that have been conducted in the US. So these negative numbers are real, but very consistent with other regions growing cover crops. So there are costs in terms of, the management of the cover crops, but also the expectation for what kind of payment programs can we offer, and what value ranges should those payment programs be targeting to manage or to compensate farmers for the risks that they might be taking, especially in these early years where they're figuring this out. So I see that one question just came up about grazing cover crops, and all of these on-farm systems here that we were or on-farm experiments were in cash crop only scenarios. We were not taking into account the value of grazing these cover crops in the fall. And there is significant value there. Dale Penner, who developed a really nice calculator for these annual crop rotations, also developed a component for taking into account that grazing value. And I think that that is a really great opportunity to leverage this calculator, maybe in a program like the PWCP, to see more about how these kinds of costs that trade off with the value from grazing. So let's talk about what's been working, because we've been talking about some challenges. Surely it can't all be doom and gloom, because farmers are using cover crops on the prairies. Maybe they've been using less in these dry years, right? Because we're taking a look at the conditions, we're managing those risks. And I think that's really wise and warranted. But we can see in this year how quickly those conditions can change. And I think in the prairies, if we are going to be chasing these soil health goals, we need to be ready for when we have moisture for growing cover crops in our systems. And so from our on-farm data set, we can see that finding those early harvest windows where we have a longer time to grow biomass. And we can see from Virginia's experiments where our cover crops really responded to having a longer growing season. Those are the windows we really want to focus on and target for making cover crops work. And so, crops that I see in rotations are cereals, and where growers are growing peas, maybe moving into Saskatchewan, maybe some of the other pulse crops that might be harvested earlier. And those crops, the low residue crops, are probably those that need these covers the most. In Manitoba, maybe that's potatoes with fall rye. It's interesting, cereals are where we have our best window, but they probably also, if we are leaving that residue in place, also have the most protection because they have the most residue. The other thing that we learned from our on-farm experiments is that fostering volunteers are really a strategy that we should be thinking about in working with just sort of the options that we have, managing costs, thinking about how we could, if we are going to seed cover crops, how we can complement volunteers that we could be expecting in the field to bring more diversity and to get more functionality out of the money we're going to invest in cover crop seed. Another strategy, and I don't have much time to talk about it today, but if you go back to that first webinar from 2022, you can hear more about this practice. This is another part of Virginia Jansen's thesis work, which was looking at fall rye termination timings with ahead of soybeans and edible beans. But the system that she found in that project was that terminating fall rye before or at planting had very minimal impact on this nitrogen fixing soybean crop. And so that is a strategy that I think is really ready to roll out. And that really works well if we're moving into some wetter years here, we were maybe bringing more soybeans back into rotations in Manitoba, this is a system that I think is worth looking at. And fall rye can also help us with trafficability and cover in the springtime. And talking about moisture, things that I'm seeing this year that are really, I think, topical for cover crops is maybe not thinking about, is thinking about cover crops at a landscape scale. So finding those wet spots this year, maybe already for full season covers or heading into fall covers that are, that we can plant much earlier. Once these wet areas dry out, getting into those zones and getting cover crops into those zones is a really effective place to start within the field. Okay, I can see that I am being my usual professor self and I'm talking a lot. And so I'm going to skip through some slides here that I thought I was going to have time to cover. And we're going to get ahead to talking about what's maybe coming down the pipe. And I started talking about that a little bit earlier. And that is really this idea of how can we get these cover crops started earlier at a time of year where we have more reliable moisture. And that is to look at strategies for intercropping cover crops. And the other reason that's really driving me in this area through talking with farmers, through on-farm research, through survey work, is to also think about the logistics and the cost of seeding cover crops. So could we think of intercropping systems as a way to really embrace these challenges that we have on the prairies and find some strategies that are maybe going to be scalable? So what would be the design criteria for some of these intercropping systems? So one is, it's got to be something that we could seed either at the same time as our cash crop. And what are those cash crops going to be on the prairies? Well, we're going to have to find an option for canola and probably for wheat to really make these systems scalable, especially in grain-only systems or grain rotations. They're also going to have to be compatible with the herbicides that we're using because we still need weed control. So what cover crop species are going to be suited to both these seeding timings, maybe the seeding methods of drilling it in the row with the cash crop or maybe in alternating rows, or after we do some weed control, either broadcasting or drilling seed later on. So this is some work that I'm doing with a new graduate student, Janelle Gawiak, and also collaborators at the University of Saskatchewan, Dr. Marissa Bourgault, and then at the University of Alberta, Dr. Linda Gorham. So this is an exciting study that we're doing across the prairies at research universities. I guess we're all research universities. Okay, I can't get through all the slides that I had prepared from Janelle's project, so I really want to take you ahead here, talked about the challenges, what are our goals for the project. I showed you here some of the sites where we're doing this research. The work that we're doing that Janelle is leading in her project is really focused on canola, and we have 3 different herbicide tolerance systems with canola: Roundup Ready, Liberty Link, and Clearfield canola, and they all bring different herbicide options. And so we're taking a mixture of cover crops and then screening them with these different herbicide options to see these different herbicide packages and looking at sort of the frequency of when we're doing weed control to see if there is sort of a Goldilocks of being able to do some weed control and still having good growth of our cover crop in these intercropping systems. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. So we've got, our canola, we're looking at pre-emergence timing of cover crops, of controlling weeds, the critical in-season period of weed control, and then thinking about desiccation at the end. So really what I want to talk about, or just give you a preview on the research that we're doing, is looking at that middle period for weed control and in-season timing. So we are screening a range of cover crops that include 2 different types of clover, or 3 different types of cloves, 4 different types of clover: red clover, white clover, subterranean clover, Persian clover, alfalfa, and Italian ryegrass. And what we found in the first year of the project in 2022 is that we really had to increase our seeding rate in these intercropping systems from 40 plants per meter squared up to 100 plants per meter squared because of the intense competition we had growing with canola. So we, in this project, were able to get cover crops to establish. And when we increased the seeding rate from 40 plants per meter squared to 100 plants per meter squared, we saw a proportional increase in cover crop establishment. So as an intercrop, we're able to get that cover crop to establish. The challenge is, can we keep that cover crop? And that's where our different herbicide strategies came in. So we were comparing, this mixture of cover crops when we were spraying it with Liberty, with Roundup Weather Max, and then Clearfield Aries. And as you might expect, the Clearfield Aries did the least damage to the cover crops. And surprisingly, Roundup, which I thought was going to kill them dead, did best in 2022. And it was Liberty, which is more of a contact herbicide, which did the most damage. Now, I would say that as we've been screening the damage from the herbicides to the cover crops, which is pretty novel, we don't have a lot of information about how cover crops stand up to these different herbicides, is the conditions under which we spray them. So these were, where we were doing this study, 2 very hot and dry years. And so I think that really accentuated the contact kill of the Liberty herbicide compared to the, slow translocation of Roundup in this study. So these are the results that we had doing these experiments under 2 very dry years that were hot. Whether these stand up to all weather conditions is something we're going to have to keep looking at, but we see some potential to find a fit and strategies. There may be potential for all 3 of these different types of herbicide tolerance systems. Now, the challenge is, if our cover crops live, who else is going to live with them? What are the weeds doing? Oh, sorry, I had some great animations there. What are the weeds doing? Okay, sorry, I'm out of step here, but I think I'm going to move along here. Is looking at weed pressure. So one thing that our research farm at Carmen is really great for is having a lot of weed pressure. Thank you, weed scientists. I've been working in Carmen for many years. And so the challenge here is finding this sweet spot where we are able to control crops or control weeds in season and still have some cover crop growth. So where we were, having trouble, we were successful in recruiting our cover crops, we were killing our cover crops with the pressure of in-season herbicide application. We also, if we didn't control the weeds, they were also limiting the amount of biomass that we were growing. So we've got to find this Goldilocks treatment that balances the time and space for cover crops to grow with our cash crops. And that's really where we are working. And here I'm flashing through some data here. So you can see that where we were limiting ourselves to pre-season only weed control options, which would not be our first choice, but this is research, right? How good is good or how bad is bad? We can see that we really had a lot of weed pressure. And then if I go back to my slide here on cover crop biomass here in Manitoba, we can see that the cover crops also sort of had limited establishment and biomass, or were established but did not end up having a lot of biomass in our pre-seed only treatments in 2022 because we had so much weed pressure. So really it's that Goldilocks of we need in-season weed control and we need cover crops that are going to tolerate the weed, the herbicides in order to have these successful intercropping systems. Okay, I'm sure I've whetted everyone's appetites for talking about intercropping. We found in our really dry conditions here, I should talk about yield because yield is important, that we had in 2022 where we had very limited cover crop survival. We had establishment but not survival. Where we had lots of weed growth at the beginning of the season that we really didn't see much difference with intercropping or cover crops compared to our control treatment, where we didn't have a lot of cover crops growing, where we had a lot of weeds growing, we didn't have really great yields. In 2023, where we had better cover crop establishment, still some damage to our cover crops, but more biomass. We saw better sort of a better Goldilocks system within the Roundup system than the Liberty system because of that contact damage. And certainly within the Clearfield system, we also saw differences in yields, largely driven by the weeds that we had in those systems rather than the cover crops themselves. Okay, again, I'm sure that there are questions that we can talk about these intercropping systems, and with the new research that I'm doing with farmers and in small plots at the research stations at Glenlee and Carmen, these sorts of intercropping systems are really where my research program is going for the next few years, while we're continuing to look at, cover crop performance, the impacts of cover crops on yield, as well as, if we are able to get more biomass from these cover crops, will we start being able to move the mark on cover crop, on soil health metrics as well. All right, well, with that, I'm just going to put up this slide here that maybe links back to some resources that are available at the Manitoba or the University of Manitoba MAKE website. As well, Manitoba has become a member of the Midwest Cover Crop Council, and we now have a whole section on the Midwest Cover Crop Council website where you can start accessing information about cover crops. Okay, Dan, how am I doing? Are there any, is there time to answer any questions? I think you're still muted there, Dan.
There we go. Yes, there's absolutely still some time to answer some questions. If anybody has questions, please put them in the Q&A portion of the Zoom tools. Thank you so much, Dr. Lawley, for a great presentation. It's great to see. I know, here at MAW with the Prairie Watershed Climate Program, over the past 2 years, there's been millions of dollars that have gone out to farmers to do and to try cover cropping. So it's been, and we're starting to see some of that come back in terms of results and in terms of establishment. So hopefully there's lots of opportunities to share some of that with the individuals like yourselves going forward to further study cover crops and how they're doing in the prairies.
Yeah, I think that there's lots of pieces coming together, even with the watersheds themselves, right? Like having people who have knowledge about cover crops that farmers can start talking with as they're building their plans for these programs is something we just haven't had in the past. And so this is a really great opportunity. And I think that if we can keep talking and keep learning from each other, there are going to be great opportunities to take on the challenges of trying to use cover crops as a tool in our prairie environment. So even though I feel like I have a lot of difficult results to share for maybe the last 5 years, I'm still really excited about what we're going to learn in the next 5 years and having more farmers utilizing cover crops through the programs that we have available through the watersheds right now, I think is only going to further drive our knowledge of how to adapt cover crops for our prairie conditions.
And it was very, very interesting to hear you talk about volunteers. It's something that has come up in a lot of our co-development sessions for Living Lab Manitoba and the future research and how to best, like you said, use those volunteers to as a cover crop. So it was great to hear you speak about volunteers in that way, and hopefully there's some great research potential for that going forward.
Yeah, it's really a shift in our mental model, right? About those volunteers. I think in the past we see them as a problem, obviously from a disease point of view, right? And we are seeing a lot of diseases that we haven't had since it's been wet this year. And so we do have to think about diseases and insect cycles when we're thinking about those volunteers, but where we can leverage them, I think they are a fantastic resource that we should be, again, changing the way we see that from problem to opportunity.
There's a great question that actually just came up from Trevor in the Q&A. Are there any trials that have livestock removing, cycling the cover crop biomass?
Okay, that is a great question. And that's been a constraint, right? Is finding these places to do integrated crop and livestock work. I am collaborating with Dr. Emma McGow from Animal Science at the University of Manitoba. And maybe not in the fall shoulder season cover crop window that I was talking about today, but we have been successful in getting funding through the beef cluster to look at annual forages in more that full season cover window. So for 2023 and 2024, Emma and I have been screening a variety of species as annual forages or full season covers. And in 2025, we will be doing a fall grazing study from those different species that we've been screening. So although here at the university, we haven't done that grazing trial yet, I think funders and certainly the Beef Cattle Research Council that's funded that work is recognizing the value of that, and we are trying to create some space to collect interesting data. So we'll be looking in that experiment, we'll be looking at plant performance, animal performance, and then in the year that follows, we'll be looking at soil measures as well from that grazing. So
Awesome.
some things to look forward to there.
Great. So if you could stop sharing, just I'm going to put the code back up for the CEUs for people to
That sounds good.
access. Oh, and we'll have one more question here. Well, I'm putting that up. There's a question here from Peter. Are there any trials of fall seed winter annuals that may reduce flea beetle pressure in the following year's canola crop?
Okay, thank you, Peter, for that plug. So another experiment that's funded by the canola growers, the Manitoba canola growers, Canola Council through their CARP program, is a project we have with Dr. Alejandro Castamanga from the Department of Entomology, where we're looking at fall-seeded fall rye as a sort of a nurse crop for canola to try and protect them from flea beetles. We've also been screening, for those of us that aren't organized enough to get our fall rye in the fall, we've also been screening oat as a nurse crop as well in the springtime. And we're definitely seeing that where we have had enough flea beetle pressure to have flea beetle damage, the benefit to the fall rye compared to the oat nurse crop. And right now, I am trying to recruit farmers for on-farm experiments to grow fall rye this fall so that we can look at flea beetle pressure on their farms next spring. So please reach out to me at the University of Manitoba if you are interested in this practice and interested in having a trial on your farm this fall.
Awesome. That was a good plug.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. I could also, thank those that have funded the research that I presented to you today. I have a range of funders from Western Grains Research Foundation, Manitoba Agriculture, General Mills, the Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers, the Manitoba Crop Alliance, who are all contributing to the research that we are able to do right now on cover crops. So it's exciting to see the long list of organizations that are seeing value in cover crops and interested in funding research to make this happen in prairie systems.
Awesome. Well, with that, we've reached 1 o'clock. So I do have the QR code for CEUs on there. If you like, again, if the code is not working for you, you can email me after and we can make sure your details are signed up and you get your credits on there. Huge thank you to Dr. Lawley for joining us today. Great presentation. It's always great to have you on it. You're always top of our list when we ever have events and things to talk about, especially when it comes to cover cropping. So but just want to plug, we have 2 more PWCP Summer Speaker Series webinars coming up, one on August 8th that'll deal with the subject of nitrogen management, and on August 29th the topic will be rotational grazing. So look out for details on those as they are coming out in the next little while. And I know there's one other question that was put in there, but we'll answer that and provide you a follow-up on that, Trevor, as well. But with that, thank you, Dr. Lawley. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. And we will, the recording of this will be on Maw's YouTube page. And I appreciate everyone joining today. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dr. Lawley.
Okay, thanks, Dan. We'll see you again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.